Hello, my name is Glenna Van Dyke. I am a history and education double major, and thank you so much for coming to my IS presentation. To give you a short 30-second summary of my project, I have created a digital exhibit that unpacks Wayne County, Ohio's local Indigenous history and how it has been portrayed by local historians for the last 150 years, and the historical context behind all of that. And I also wrote an accompanying essay that looks at how this exhibit interacts with what other historians in similar fields are doing. Before I dive into my presentation, I would also like to thank my advisor, Dr. Holt, for all of her help, my partners from the Wyandot Nation, the Delaware Nation, and the Delaware Tribe of Indians for their continued review of my project, and the Copeland Funding Committee for allowing me to properly compensate my tribal nation partners. Here's a short overview of what I'll be going over in this presentation. I am going to be focusing more on the web project aspect of things, but I would be more than happy to answer any questions you have about my essay as well. Speaking of my website, here's a QR code that you can scan if you would like to view my website while I am presenting. However, before I dive too deeply into the web exhibit, I want to talk a little bit about how this project came about, especially through a few experiential learning opportunities that I had through the college. When I came to Worcester, I knew I wanted to pursue history, but I didn't really know what my specific focus was going to be in terms of time and place. And so I really was able to develop my niche through a couple summer internships. The first is the Worcester Digital History Project. This is a local research initiative that's run by history faculty and students. And so I was employed as a researcher for 2 summers. The first summer, I was helping to redesign the worcesterhistory.org site. And the second summer, I was also a team leader, and I was in charge of helping develop a larger exhibit, a larger web exhibit on Worcester's history. And specifically, I researched Worcester's Indigenous and early white settlement history. And so these 2 summers really gave me not only a very nuanced understanding of Wayne County and Worcester's history, but it also gave me the inspiration to write about the discrepancies that I was noticing in a couple of the key resources on Wayne County's Indigenous history and how they were minimizing Indigenous perspectives. And it also gave me a really good idea of how web design and digital history can be used as a really powerful tool for communicating history. After those 2 summers, I wrote my junior IS on these key sources and how they were narrating Indigenous history and how it created a settler colonialist memory in Wayne County and the implications of that more broadly. And then after that, I was honored to become an Apex Fellow for the Wayne County Historical Society of Ohio. And while this internship was more focused on the practical skills needed by public historians in small museums, I was also able to connect with a lot of currently practicing local historians. And I was also able to get a better idea of who my audience would be if I created a public facing project for my senior IS. So this slide goes more deeply into what I was just talking about with this kind of central problem that I'm trying to tackle in my IS. And so the central problem really is that there is essentially one author who has authority over how Wayne County's Indigenous history is being narrated. Benjamin Douglas published the first full length book on Wayne County's history in 1878. And while there had been a couple mentions in statewide histories, this was really the first author to write a full book about Wayne County. And so he not only was the first author, but he also had access to oral histories and primary source documents that have since been lost. And so he really controls authority over how Indigenous history has been remembered and narrated in Wayne County. And what you will see is that the perspectives that he promotes in his work and the interpretations of Indigenous people that he relies on can still be seen in more contemporary narrations of local history in books and print culture, etc. And so, first, my IS is trying to figure out how I can provide an alternative view to this communicated history. But I also wanted to know if I could communicate this to the public and get this message to audiences outside of the College of Wooster. And then third, I also wanted to involve Indigenous communities in the telling of their own histories in a way that had not really been done before. And so all of these questions underlie the web exhibit especially. And so this slide goes into each section. There are three, what you can call chapters in this web exhibit that you can explore in any order. And so I list them here just in the order that I created them. So the first section goes into the common myths of Indigenous history that are especially present within Benjamin Douglas's text, where they come from, and how they can be not only identified but also countered, especially with regional and national scholarship. The second section is an Indigenous history of Wayne County that combines local information, regional context, and extended tribal histories to really illustrate the richness of Indigenous history in this area. And so this was especially informed by my partnerships with the Delaware and Wyandot nations. And then lastly, my third section is the historical context of local history in this area and how this ties into justifications of white settlement on indigenous lands. And so this goes all the way from the beginnings of American local history in the early 1800s, all the way through how local history is still being narrated in Wayne County today. And so ultimately, I really hope that this web project is not only useful to folks within Wayne County, but that it can act as a model and a jumping off point for other local historians who have similar texts and are similarly looking to promote a different narrative about Indigenous people in their local area, or who are looking to read local history more critically. And so, while historical research, of course, is the center of any history IS, I also had to develop a lot of other skills with the digital project that had their own learning curves. The central idea of this is this idea of digital storytelling. So, this is how do we take a complex story and optimize it for a digital platform? How do we really make it come alive? And so, this really informed the whole website creation process. I first had to spend a lot of time figuring out how I wanted to lay everything out and how I wanted everything to be organized. And then I also had to transfer a lot of my previously done research to what is called public writing versus academic writing. So making sure that it was going to be understandable to people who aren't history professors, and how I can tell a compelling story that doesn't get rid of any of the information, but just makes it easier to understand. I also had to really think about how I wanted to integrate different types of media into my project. So, not only written text, but maps, videos, images, interactive elements that would really make this story come alive. But I also really wanted to make sure that I was upholding the academic standard of being very clear about where my information was coming from. So, throughout my website, you will see both hyperlinks and footnotes that really make sure that I'm being very clear about how I'm citing my sources. Along with that, I really had to think about not only how do I build a website, but how do I make this website accessible no matter who might be looking at it. And so accessibility also really underlies everything about this website. Everything from information organization, so thinking about how I could present my information in a way that would make sense, to how I could make my writing easy to understand, especially when you're reading it on a computer or a phone, which is a very different experience from reading a physical text. I also had to think about how I could make this site accessible for people with different needs. So, for example, if you only have access to a mobile phone, can you still have a meaningful experience on my website? Or if you have some sort of visual impairment, can you still engage with my site in a meaningful way? And then lastly, I also wanted to make sure that my design was accessible for any person to be able to look at my website and be able to retrieve the information quickly. So you'll see a fairly pared down design when it comes to things like color and font choice. And this was very intentional to make sure that my site was easy on the eyes. So for the next section of my presentation, I want to talk about the collaborations that really made this project work. And the most important, of course, was my collaboration with the Delaware Nation, the Wyandot Nation, and the Delaware Tribe of Indians. I really wanted to make sure that I was getting feedback from Indigenous communities to really start to reverse the erasure of Indigenous history that was so pervasive in this area. The two biggest lessons that I learned were first, the importance of reaching out early so that those relationships would already be established by the time I started writing. And second, the importance of setting aside your ego as a researcher and really recognizing that certain things are simply going to be out of your realm of knowledge because you do not have that lived experience. And it is a skill in itself to give that authority to someone who has that lived experience. This just provides a short timeline of how I was able to connect with Indigenous communities. I especially tried to focus on historic preservationists and cultural preservationists who already had this experience. And I was also very thankful to be able to compensate these tribal nation partners properly. This isn't necessarily the same as just taking a research subject out to lunch. This was really acknowledging the fact that Indigenous people have been so exploited by especially academic researchers for centuries. And so making sure that that relationship is starting to be healed is was very, very important to me. And so I was able to compensate them, especially with gifts that tied into the local area, which was also a very important part of the compensation process. And so I was very thankful for the Copeland funding for allowing me to do that. This project also really deepened my relationship to local historians in Wayne County, Ohio, who I really try to acknowledge in my project, provide super valuable work to the local community. Even if they're relying on outdated sources, what they're doing is extremely important and is well worth the community's support. And so I especially was really able to partner with the Historical Society and the Public Library's genealogy room. They were both very, very helpful in my research process. I had a couple folks approach me with sources that they wanted me to try and use, some of which were very, very local and turned out to be extremely helpful for my project. And the local historical community here also gave me an audience to really think about as I was constructing this project, and ultimately an audience that then I was able to present this to. I was able to go to the February Board of Trustees meeting for the Wayne County Historical Society and actually formally present this project to the board. So that really ensured that this project was going to have a real live audience, which was very important. Lastly, I just want to offer some final thoughts on my project. I really think that the web is not only going to change how history is done, but it's also really going to change who is represented within it and how that is done. This project really allowed me to incorporate authentic Indigenous experiences in a way that I don't think was necessarily possible in written scholarship. And I think this also expands what is counted as historical scholarship. Not only is this making a historical argument, but it is also acting as a model for local historians to create their own collaborations with Indigenous communities to reinterpret Indigenous history in a new way. And then I think this definitely has the potential to have a broader impact on just the relationship between Indigenous communities and non Indigenous communities in the United States, especially starting at that local level, because these local texts are so ubiquitous and the way that we interpret Indigenous history has very real social and political consequences for Indigenous communities that are trying to gain land sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, and reparations for what was done to them in the past. And so, with that, I really want to thank you so much for listening to my project. If you have any questions, feel free to write them down or just send me a contact form through my website. Thank you so much again.